All right, we are back. Sorry for the delay, everybody. We are picking up where we left off in this epic review of Inspiring Philosophy's video, Moral Realism Defended. So the last time we spent nearly 2 hours getting through 7 minutes of the video. Now, I should say that that's probably because the video is well constructed in many ways. It's very informationally dense. It gets straight to the point and moves straight through the arguments. It doesn't have a lot of fluff. So even though it's only about a 14, 15-minute video, I think that's a good thing about this. It gives us lots of meat to work with. But, unlike my live streams where I talk for 1 or 2 or 3 hours and I say the same thing 7 different ways or give 40 different examples or whatever, or I get too animated and I wave my arms around and then Danny's sitting there all silent for like 10 minutes while I'm going, that this video at least it's like very dense. Okay, see, I'm saying the same thing twice. Okay, so anyway, we're back today.
I want to defend you for a second because the returning viewers, they're familiar with the kind of criticisms that we're offering, but there are many people that are going to watch this video that are not familiar with the other videos or content that Lance produces. So it's good to go over objections that while the average, the returning viewer may already know, to go over them for the new viewers. So I think that you're doing, it's good to kind of go from step one.
Fair enough. I'll say a couple other things. One is that often an adequate rebuttal to or explanation for why some point that's being made is mistaken takes more effort than making the mistake in the first place. So to the extent that I think that there are concerns in the video, it takes more work to really get into them. Like yesterday or a couple days ago, when we were covering this, I got into a pretty detailed explanation about appraiser and agent relativism. Now, the other thing I would just say is those explanations are often not the conventional way that philosophers tend to respond to these sorts of criticisms. In fact, I almost never see anybody respond with many of the points that I raise. The other thing that I'll emphasize is that a lot of the ways that philosophers traditionally handle disputes is that someone presents an argument and then they just take the premises and the argument for granted as like they are meaningful, they are substantive, and then they're like, okay, well, I reject the first premise and here's my counter argument or here's an alternative view. I don't tend to do that. I think a lot of arguments are actually quite vacuous, and that really it's not so much about the argument, but about the surrounding sociological and rhetorical context in which arguments are situated. And by focusing on, in some ways, the metaphilosophical considerations relevant to the construction of arguments and the sort of sociological conditions in which arguments are presented and the form they take and why they take that form and what's really going on kind of when you pull back the dialectical curtain and look at what's really motivating people and driving them, I think often you see that there are very serious problems there that once they are exposed, it just obviates the need to analyze the arguments in the first place. One example of this would just be the point that I'm constantly making about normative entanglement. So since we just started, I'll give people a quick overview of that because I think it's one of the most useful ideas I proposed. It sounds really obnoxious and conceited to say this is a useful idea. I say lots of goofy things. This is a useful idea. I don't even, if it's in the literature somewhere, I would be happy to give someone else credit for the idea. I just want this idea out there. Here's how that works. So Dan, are you familiar with it? You want to give your own explanation?
Yeah. So I guess I'm going to explain it one way, and it might be a little bit different from you, and you can correct me again if I'm not explaining it the way, but this is the way I conceive of it, is that there are terms, and then there's like the metaphysical underpinnings or the stuff or the conditions that make those terms or make those statements true or false. So for instance, so when we look at the terms that moral realists use and the terms that anti-realists use, they're actually largely the same. Anti-realists will say something is wrong. We have no problem with saying that. Realists will say something is wrong. But when realists say something is wrong, implicitly they're forwarding a whole thesis about what makes that statement wrong, namely these stance-independent moral facts. Whereas the anti-realists, when they say something is wrong, which is the same language, they're not. That's not part of their model of or what makes their statements about something wrong being true or false, or their expression of rightness or wrong problematic. So I think the idea is that we use the same terms. When they give objections to us saying, well, look, you're saying it's wrong. Well, we're not implicitly accepting your model, your metaphysical framework, your moral, the stance independent facts that make your sense of wrongness intelligible according to your view, right? Like, so that's how I kind of see it.
Yeah. Let me give an example because I think that's a good way to put it. And I do think it generalizes outside of the meta-ethical context. Let's say you have two people with very different metaphysical frameworks. Let's say one of those people is a substance dualist, and they think that there are two sort of fundamentally distinct substances. They think that there's mind and there's matter. There's physical stuff and there's this non-physical mental stuff. And they are just fundamentally metaphysically distinct from one another. Then you have another person who's a physicalist. Now imagine that they're having a conversation and the physicalist is arguing with the substance dualist, and they're like, look, do you think that people have beliefs? And then the substance dualist is like, yes, of course people have beliefs. And they're like, aha, so you acknowledge so sorry, they say, aha, so given that beliefs are by their very nature reducible to physical facts about the structure of the brain or whatever physical container the belief is manifested in, you're acknowledging that beliefs are fundamentally physical. You are claiming that they're non-physical, but a belief just is a physical thing, so you're acknowledging that they're physical. That would be a really weird thing to do because the substantialists might say, well, hold up. I do think that there are beliefs, but my view about the belief, and if it's not a belief, then it could be some other sort of mental state or whatever it is that the substantialist thinks is not physical. But they could say, look, I'm agreeing that I'm using the term, but I'm not granting your conception of the meaning of that term, of the underlying metaphysical presuppositions you're bringing to bear. So maybe you think of the mental states as physical, but I don't. I'm not committed to your conception of what a belief is. It would be really weird for the physicalist to respond, wait, but a belief just is something that's reducible to something physical. So if you're using the term, you're committed to a physical account of belief. That would be weird because it's as if the physicalist is not understanding that what's in contention is the metaphysical status of a belief or whatever mental state is under dispute. And so simply because someone else has a particular conception of some usage of a term in mind doesn't mean that you yourself are committed to that usage as well. You have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, and I want to. There's another case where this happens. It's largely related to the disputes between realists and anti-realists concerning moral obligations or whatever. Is in conversations about meaning and purpose. So let's say a theist were to ask, "Well, do you think there's purpose in the world? Do you think there's meaning?" And the atheist just says, "Yeah, I think there is." Aha! So you're committed to a kind of meaning that overarches, cosmically, and you need God to ground a cosmic kind of meaning. I'm like, wait, whoa, just a second. I think there's meaning and purpose, but I don't think there's cosmic meaning and purpose, or I don't think there's God meaning and purpose. Like, I just think that there's meaning and purpose. And just because I'm using those terms and I'm assenting to the statement there is meaning and purpose doesn't commit me to your whole theistic framework.
Yeah, there are so many examples of this. Another example, and this was my latest blog post, which is called Jack and the Giant Qualia. I used an example that I got from Pete Mandic, who's a philosopher of mind, who wrote what is now my favorite paper on consciousness. It's on qualia quietism, which, according to Pete Mandic, certain concepts that are used in philosophy of mind, like qualia, phenomenal state, what it's likeness, that sort of thing, that those terms are meaningless and that you can't really say anything substantive about them. I endorse that view. And I'm there's not a whole lot of us. Danny probably doesn't agree with that view. That's okay if you don't. We don't have to agree on everything. In fact, we probably disagree on some. It's cool that we get along in spite of our disagreements. Anyway, so what's really interesting about conversations in philosophy of mind is that they also frequently take the same form. And I give a kind of fictional, it's intended to be a bit silly, an unrealistic situation, but you can have a situation where one person says, imagine a person walks up and they're holding some beans and they say, look, I have some magical beans. And, you react to that person by going, okay, well, I see that you have beans. I'm not so sure they're magical though. Now imagine if that person didn't say, oh no, these beans totally are magical. Now you're having a legitimate dispute. You both agree there's beans. The dispute is, are the beans magical? Now there could be a question, what do you mean by magical? What kind of magical powers do they have? About the meaning of the word magical, that I'm going to say, well, something's only magical if it contravenes the laws of physics. And if it contravenes the laws of physics, there'd be no empirical test you could do to show. So there's no way to show it's actually magic. I'm not going to be like that. If the person says, look, if I throw these on the ground and I utter an incantation, it's going to grow a giant plant instantaneously into the sky that goes up into a cloud that has a castle full of treasure. Okay, if they proceeded to do that, sure, those are magic beans. Okay, I'm cool with that. Or if they say, if you eat the bean, you'll live forever, or you get like powers like in a superhero movie, fine, magic beans. I'm cool with that. Now, what if instead, so you express skepticism about whether the beans are magical. The person responds by saying, wait, so you're saying I don't have any beans? They're right here. Look. And you can clearly see the beans. And you're like, no, I agree you have beans. I just don't think they're magical. And they're like, okay, I don't think you understand. Because these are magical beans, if you're denying they're magical, you're denying I have anything in my hand. You're saying there's nothing in my hand. There's clearly something in my hand. So you must be a complete idiot. How can you be so stupid? Of course there's magic beans in my hand. And then again, you could say, no. There are beans, and I'm denying that they have a specific property that you're claiming that they have. There are beans. They are not magical. Now, that person might be thinking something like, look, it is so, like, it's so constitutive of the nature of the thing I'm holding in my hand that it is magical, that to deny it is magical is to deny it exists at all. And that is a very, very common problem that I see, at least in online philosophical disputes. But I think that this even bleeds into how many philosophers sort of unconsciously think about these issues, which is that they sort of bake their metaphysics or their conceptual characteristics into the terms or the concepts that they're employing. And then if someone has a different conception of the term or concept, they don't take that to be, there's a sort of a, we agree that there's like a thing in need of explaining or conceptualization, but we disagree on its conceptual content. They think if you don't share the same concept, you're not referring to the same thing at all. And this happens in arguments about consciousness where illusionists deny that there is phenomenal consciousness or qualia, characterizing qualia in a specific way. And their critics will say, so you don't think there's consciousness? This is very silly. Illusionists do not have to, they could, if they want, deny that there's consciousness. But it'd be more appropriate to say that they have a different characterization of consciousness than proponents of phenomenal consciousness. So they think there's stuff to explain. They just don't think that the explanation involves an appeal to private, ineffable, incommunicable, and non-relational properties. There's a few other characteristics that you could find in like Coining Qualia from Dennett on this. So this is a really common thing. Now let's bring it back to normative entanglement. We're taking a while, but I like covering a range of examples because what I want to show is that this problem generalizes, but it also occurs in metaethics in a really clear way. Here's how it works in metaethics. And this is actually more straightforward in metaethics. Here's an exchange that you could see. A moral realist will ask an anti-realist, hey, so you're an anti-realist, right? The person's like, yeah. And they're like, okay, so do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? Now, think about what the person is asking. Do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? The anti-realist really they have three options here. They could say yes, they could say no, or they could say something else. And it could be something like, I refuse to answer your question, or I don't think it's a good question, or whatever. But they got yes, no, and whatever else they might want to say. Now, of course, the third option is actually like all the other, there's infinite number of things you could say. Now, when a person asks what appears to be a clear yes, no question, you're already paying you could say argumentative cost or performative cost in front of an audience to not give a yes, no answer. Because if you don't give a yes, no answer to a yes, no question, were you at the scene of the crime on October 16th at 2 p.m. and you don't say no, automatically people are going to think that the answer is yes, or very, very suspicious that you're not saying no. So you have an issue where you don't give a clear yes, no answer. Now, the problem is that the question is, if you say yes, you can't consistently say that as an anti-realist, because your view is that there is nothing objectively right or wrong. So if someone says, is it objectively wrong to X? The answer can't be yes. So your only options are no, or to give some other option if you want to be consistent and not like lie or immediately recant your position. Now, if you say no, imagine you have a person on a stage. Imagine it's a person like running for office, or they're at a press conference and the whole world is watching on TV. And they're asked, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? And the person's like, no. They're done. They are done, because people are going to think that they're saying it's okay to torture babies, or that they don't care about torturing babies, or that they're not very opposed to torturing babies. So the problem here is that if you look at how the question is being asked, is it objectively wrong to X? What it's doing is it's asking a normative question, is it wrong to X? And then it's rolling that in to a metaethical question. And so technically, there's 4 positions a person could take towards, is it objectively wrong to X? It is objectively wrong. Like there are objective facts, and this is one of them. There are, hey, I think there are objective facts, just this isn't one of them. They could think there's no objective facts, but still think it's wrong in some non-objective way, or they could think there's no objective facts and not think it's wrong in an objective or non-objective way. So there's actually 4 categories. You could draw like a box where it's yes, it's objective, yes, it's wrong. Yes, it's objective, no, it's not wrong. Yes, it's objective. Sorry. No, it's not objective. Yes, it's wrong. And no, it's not objective. And no, it's not wrong. You have 4 options. If you say yes, you're automatically put in that first box. Yes, it's objective, and yes, it's wrong. If you say no, that's indeterminate between the other 3 boxes. And so the question is not an appropriate question. It's a kind of complex question that embeds 2 notions in one another simultaneously, such that to give a yes does give a determinate answer, but to give a no doesn't. It gives an unclear answer that's consistent with you not holding the normative moral standard that it's wrong to do whatever X is. And that actually could, on Bayesian grounds, cause someone to legitimately update in favor of the likelihood that you, in fact, are okay with baby torture, if that's the question. Because if someone says, hey, is it objectively wrong to torture babies? And you say yes, clearly you're against baby torture. But if you say no, is it no because you don't think it's objectively wrong, but you do think it's wrong? Or is it because you don't think it's wrong to torture babies at all, regardless of whether they're objective facts or not? So you see, the question is a kind of trap. And yet, moral realists, including professional philosophers, use traps like this all the time. They embed their meta-ethical position inside normative claims to give, and this is the key point about normative entanglement, the false and misleading impression that to deny the objectivist meta-ethical question, it carries this implication or this allusion to or hint that you actually have awful normative moral standards and you're a terrible, evil, no good, very bad person. And that is totally unearned. It's an inappropriate question. So I think that's important. And because you'll see realists doing this all the time, they try to smear anti-realists by implying that they're evil people with bad normative standards. And the reason that's wrong, it's not appropriate to do that, is because you're not actually refuting the meta-ethical position. You're trying to give the false impression that the anti-realist has bad normative standards, which you haven't actually shown. You're just implying it. Sorry, I could go on about this forever because it's just such an awful thing.
But it happens so often. It's not like this is a once in a blue moon thing. This happens constantly in these sort of discussions.
Have you encountered this yourself before you met me?
Many times. Often a lot of people are unprepared because they know how bad it sounds when we say something like it's not objectively bad, wrong. And that kind of goes to what you said in another video and in a lot of your videos. There's not a very clear sense of what people mean by objective as well. So it's even more complicated because if by objective they don't mean stance independent, then there's a sense in which we could say it's objectively wrong. Like
yeah, a constructivist could say yes, there are constructivist procedures whereby there would be facts about what's right or wrong, and they're true independent of my values or your values, like as long as you follow the standard. So like if you're an ideal observer theorist and someone says, are there objective facts about what's right or wrong? I think if I was, I would say yes, but they're not stance independent. So that would just come down to like whether we want to use the term objective synonymously with stance independence. Sometimes people do, sometimes they don't.
Sometimes people don't. And sometimes they would, when you really ask what objective means, it's compatible with anti-realism completely. So that makes that complicate. There's another layer there. So it's good to clarify with your interlocutor. Okay, well, look, if you're asking me if this is objectively wrong, if what you're asking is if it stands independently wrong, then no. But is that what you mean by objective? Because sometimes I even use the word objective not to mean stance independently wrong.
But you see, even asking the question, it starts to make you look evasive. So another thing that happens, because people will do this, up to the anti-realist. Do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? If you don't go quick with the no, they'll go, oh, you're hesitating. I wonder why. And again, it's the implication that there's something bad about being an anti-realist. And it's bad because you're not so quick to condemn baby torture. And it's like, if they said, hey, do you condemn baby torture? What do you think an anti-realist is going to do? Say no? Of course they're not. They're going to be like, hell yeah, I condemn it. It's awful, right? And so the problem is that they're implying that the anti-realist isn't in a position to condemn or oppose baby torture without actually showing it. And they're asking a tricky philosophical question to do that. Why do that? Why? What is the point of doing that? Now, if like, here's what I could say about that. If your intention is to deliberately, misleadingly, and in a really deceptive and disingenuous way, try to basically like smear anti-realists in a really shitty, unethical way, that's a perfectly good question to ask. If your goal is to demonstrate that there is an actual like philosophical problem or weakness with anti-realism, philosophers do it all the time. They actually do something worse than this, which is they actually drop references to objectivity or stance independence, and they'll just say, hey, do you think it's wrong to torture babies for fun? And the problem there is that now it's just ambiguous, wrong in a stance independent way or wrong in a stance dependent way. Now, what they do there oftentimes is if you say yes, they'll go, aha, so you are accepting that you have a realist position, which is stupid because an anti-realist can think things are non-stance independently wrong. They can think it's wrong, just not in a stance independent way. So there's no inconsistency when they say that. But what they can do is just be ambiguous in purpose and then do a post hoc, like they could clarify what they mean after you answer. So, hey, is it to the anti-realist, is it wrong to torture babies for fun? If you say yes, then they will say, I meant it in a realist way. So you're admitting you're a realist or you have realist intuitions. Gotcha. And if you say no, they'll go, so you don't even think it's normatively wrong? You're an evil monster. Gotcha. So again, it's a rhetorical trap. It is a trap where it's like, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. And again, there is no good reason, if you're sincerely interested in criticizing an anti-realist position, to ask the question in that way. The other thing is, it's also kind of a stupid question. So imagine someone says, I'm a utilitarian, right? So the person says they think you should always maximize utility. Here's an easy way to make utilitarians look bad. You can always just say, what if, and then you just give any horrible description you want, like peeling the skin off of people and wearing it as a mask would maximize utility. Would you be okay with peeling people's skin off and wearing it around town if it maximized utility? If you're a utilitarian, the answer would be yes. You go, okay, so you're just one step away at any moment from flaying people's skins. Like you could just make them look like a evil lunatic super duper easily. And it's just such a cheap shot. And what I don't understand is how it's obviously a super lame cheap shot. And yet, again, this is not just people on like TikTok. This is professional philosophers will take these stupid sniper gotcha shots at robust philosophical positions that have been out there in the literature. I'm not saying I endorse all these positions, like when I say robust. I mean, like these are like serious positions that are in the literature, and then people take these gotcha shots at them. It's so stupid, and it persists.
Well,
it gets me animated.
That brings us to the video.
Yeah, let's get to it.
All right.
So we're picking up where we left off.
Let me full screen this. All right. I think we were around 6:30-ish. We did this slide. I remember this.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm inclined to think we're over here. So I'll play it from here. Okay.
Horrid like genocide. So since we disagree with other views of morality and consider them to be either wrong or right, then it is more likely moral realism is true. If this was not the case, there would be no reason to disagree, since all would be subjective, and the cultures that oppress women would just be other ways to view the moral landscape. Again, as with experience, actions speak louder than words. Andrew Fisher builds on this with a similar argument. It is the argument for moral progress. Moral progress can only make sense in terms of realism. The majority of people no longer think it is acceptable to enslave other races or murder people just because they are of a different tribe. If we consider this as progress, it would only make sense if we were slowly working towards an objective moral standard and not just...
Did you pause? Did you want to pause it?
Yeah. Did you have thoughts on that?
Well, look, this is I mean, if I were in a discussion with an uninspiring philosophy, I would just ask him why. But I mean, as far as a criticism, I mean, I'm more of the person that would want them to support the there would be a burden here. But what would you think? Do you? I mean, obviously, I would disagree. I mean, how would you handle if someone just said this?
Yeah, I'm not seeing an argument here. I'm seeing an assertion.
Right.
Where's the argument? Mm-hmm. So he's saying it would only make sense on a realist presumption. Why? Mm-hmm. So just to pump the intuition that this is not very plausible, do you think that there's been progress in, let's say, gastronomy, like the preparation of food, culinary arts?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think so. I mean, compare it from now to like 20,000 years ago. Has there been progress? Yes. Does that mean that there are stance independent gastronomic facts and they're like about what food is good or bad? No. So you can make progress relative to some standard goal, preference, value, whatever. So if you, for instance, really like really realistic art, like you're really into artistic like realism, you could say, yeah, there's been progress over the past 5,000 years with respect to art being produced that's more realist. Now, you could say there's like local deviations and regressions in certain kinds of like modern art, but overall, more and more people have developed the skills and techniques to produce the kind of art that you think is good. And you could say that there's progress relative to that. In music, you could say that there's progress in music references. There's no, if there's a logical problem or some kind of like conceptual issue with progress relative to goals or standards, I don't know what it is, and we haven't seen any objections to that yet. All we've seen is the assertion, if we consider this as progress, it would only make sense if there were an objective standard. So what's the argument? So that's one issue. The other is, look at the contrast that's being proposed here, and not just arbitrarily changing morality. What is it? What's meant by arbitrary? So, for instance, with time, we've made more and more take beer. There's all kinds of different beer out there now. There's like all these craft beers. There's IPAs and really cool and interesting flavors. Or take pizza. It's not, we have all these types of cheese now. There's way more kinds of cheese now than there were 3,000 years ago. And like tomatoes and really good olive oil and all the stuff you could add to pizza to make it better. Has there, would you say that those changes are arbitrary? What exactly is meant by arbitrary? Because what prompted all these?
Before you explain, sorry to interrupt. Before you explain, I need to pause for a second. An issue came up. I put it on Facebook for a second. Like I messaged you on Facebook. I'll be right back. Okay. If you could explain the arbitrary thing, and then I'll give you my thoughts on the arbitrary thing as well.
No problem.
Okay.
So, this concern about it being arbitrary, we'll have to see if there's any elaboration, but if there's not, there's going to be two issues here. One is that what we have here is an assertion without an argument, which is hardly any sort of substantive objection, especially if nothing about that assertion strikes me as especially plausible in the first place. And it doesn't strike me as plausible. Why can't there be progress relative to values or standards? And then the second issue is this stuff about arbitrarily changing morality. I would like to know what's meant by arbitrary. Again, maybe we'll see more of that in the video. But I think at the very least that there's a certain kind of rhetorical push that's being made here that I'm not so sure that I'm going to buy into. And, to go back to the food analogy, have changes in our culinary practices, are they arbitrary? Well, no, not in the sense of it being like a flip of a coin. They have a particular trajectory, and the trajectory is among other things, improving the range and depth of human enjoyment from food consumption. And it's the taste, the smell, the environment. Like, people have designed really cool restaurants that are an interesting atmosphere. So, better food makes one feel better. It gives one certain kinds of sensory experiences. It makes one happier. So we've made progress with respect to creating better dining experiences. Now, better in an objective way? No, better relative to people's preferences. Those preferences could have been different, and those people wouldn't have been mistaken. So if it turned out, human evolution had been very different, and like spicy foods tasted terrible, or alcohol was really, really disgusting, or sugary things were nasty and we only like savory things, then, new desserts wouldn't be good relative to that set of preferences. And so the kinds of progress that we made is progress relative to like tweaking things in the world around us, tweaking the methods we use to prepare food in order to make that food more suitable to human preferences. But our preferences aren't objectively correct preferences. They are what they are. And so I think it's very clear that it'd be a little weird to say that there's been no progress in music, no progress in art, no progress in gastronomy, unless those are understood to be objective. I think that strikes me. There's an appeal to intuition. But also it's not just a brute appeal to intuition. It's just, what would you call it? Like, I don't see any issue with saying, okay, if given a goal or standard, there is a sort of landscape of possible ways the world could be, and the intentional development of technologies, innovations, actions, behaviors, patterns, those sorts of things that bring us closer towards achieving those goals, or maximizing for the achievement of those goals to a greater extent than previously. Looks like progress to me. And then you could also think of like a lot of mundane types of progress. Like, let's say that you start a new exercise routine and you want to be able to run a 5K or something like that. And you get better and better. You're making progress towards that goal. Is your goal objectively correct? What would that even mean? You could just set a goal and then make progress relative to that goal. And there's no fact of the matter about what your goals must be independent of your goals or standards. Like, that would be silly. And so I think it's already the case that we speak and think in terms, most people speak and think in terms of progress relative to goals. And so I just don't buy that there's any sort of issue here. And I don't buy that it's arbitrary. So if I set a goal of, running a 5K, and I do exercise, like, it would be weird if I like did random things to get better at that. But if I do things like jog every day, arbitrary as progress towards the goal of running a fight, that seems ridiculous. What's arbitrary about that? And look, if someone wants to say, oh, well, it's by arbitrary, I mean that it isn't directed towards some objective standard or goal, then okay, so then the problem is, hey, if you don't accept that there's objective progress, then it's not the case that there's objective progress. Like, then it just ends up being a tautology. So, like, I'm happy if someone wants to flesh out the concept of arbitrariness to do so, and it's either, I think, going to be false that it's arbitrary, or trivial that it's arbitrary, and neither of those are going to concern me overly much. Welcome back, Danny. Everything good?
Yeah, everything's good. So, I'm sorry I didn't catch what you said, but if you had to readdress this, because let's say someone wants to say that, and let's say they're using the language of preference, okay? People have preferences that, or they prefer for healthy children, for children to be healthy rather than not. They prefer, that elderly people have health care, or that they're I don't know. They have all these preferences about how society should be, or whatever. And then the charge is that, well, those are just, where do those come from? Okay, well, justify your preferences. And I can understand how one value or one preference emerges from another. Like, if I prefer that children not go hungry, then that might explain why I prefer to give to this charity rather than that charity, or something like that. So there can be a whole line of preferences, but it's not going to go ad infinitum. There's going to be a point where your preferences bottom out. And then sometimes I hear the charge, well, look, if they bottom out, then they're just arbitrary. And they're also subject to change, given that there's nothing necessary about your preferences. You could wake up tomorrow with really different preferences, and then suddenly everything is justified, or something like that. Or anything can be justified. The first thing is that I'm not quite sure that objection doesn't apply to a kind of realism. I could imagine a realism where every 5 years all the moral facts invert. So what would be stopping? What would be incoherent about that view? The moral facts could change every minute. So it doesn't seem like, I don't see any logical bar that they couldn't, and that they must be absolute or universal. So even if it were a problem, I mean, fine. But it's not a problem exclusive to anti-realism. And the second thing is that preferences, while they might not be, while we might not offer a justification for a fundamental preference, which just seems contradictory, they're still explained. They still have causal explanations, and in that, there's a sense in which they're not arbitrary. Why do I prefer to eat gumbo over sopa de res, which is a type of stew in Latin America? Well, because I was raised in Louisiana. So, I mean, that's a satisfactory explanation for most for why I have a stronger preference for eating gumbo over sopa de res. I mean, it could be arbitrary. If the word arbitrary is being used, it just means that it's not really up to me that I have that preference. Well, fine. I mean, But it's not, I mean, it's not up to me. I just wanted to know what you think about that kind of discussion of arbitrary with respect to where our preferences come from, our fundamental stances. What's your analysis about all of that?
Yeah, I just agree with what you've said. So this is a point where it's often rather puzzling if someone has an expectation that one offer a justification for their preferences or values. From a realist perspective, if you're Derek Parfit or something, you might think that there are stance independent facts about what values or moral standards you ought to have. And so if a person goes around with a standard where they think it's okay to harm people just for fun, a realist might think they ought not have that standard. Like they shouldn't have the standard. The standard itself, it's morally bad to have the standard. Or they might say it's you ought not have the standard. You have a duty to change your standards or whatever. However they want to phrase it. To me, that strikes, on my view, it strikes me as like a kind of category error. What values or preferences you have are what you could say are just a given. They're just a fact about you. They're a psychological fact in the same way that there would be like a physical fact about me, like about my hair color or how tall I am or something. And it'd be really weird, like my name is Lance. And if someone said like, justify why your name is Lance, it's a weird, or like whatever, my blood type, like, I don't know what it is, A negative or whatever. Justify, like on normative grounds, why you ought to have your blood type. What does that even mean? It's a descriptive fact. How can I give a normative justification for a descriptive fact that just is the way that it is? I think the question itself or the demand itself is presupposing that there's a conception of justification that I'm not granting in the first place. So when it comes to, if you are value and there's facts about what you value, and if I make claims about what's good or bad, they're true or false relative to my values, and if you make claims they're true or false relative to your values, if someone wants to say, but your and their values are arbitrary because you haven't given any justification for them, they lack grounding, they're not objective, that's more or less just repeating the objectivist position. And so it just sounds like the objection that the objectivist has, or the realist has, to the anti-realist is, you're not a realist. My objection is you're not a realist. And then you just use, disparaging sneer words like arbitrary to make the position sound bad. And again, it's just empty rhetoric. Imagine if someone demanded you give a justification for like why you like or dislike cilantro. Justify it. Well, it's just a fact about you whether you like it or not. Are you a cilantro liker or not?
I am.
Yeah, I like cilantro too. My wife doesn't like cilantro. So it'd be weird if someone was like, I demand like a justification, right? So I think that something like that might be lurking behind this. But for me, and this is where you and I differ, you're focusing on that point, which I agree with. But I also want to focus on like what would motivate someone to frame the position in this way. And I think that the motivation to frame it in this way is at least partially driven, if not intentionally, then unintentionally, because this is an effective way of making alternative positions look bad. It's a way of implying that there's something objectionable about not being a realist. Oh, you don't want to have an arbitrary moral system. You want a non-arbitrary moral system. And like that's when you unpack what's being stated, it ends up just looking like you don't want to have a non-realist position, which is just a restatement of the position. It's not saying anything that should really make a person inclined towards that view to go, oh no, there's a problem here. It's just using some other set of terminology that kind of makes this position seem smelly. And like positions aren't wrong because you could use language to make them look bad.
Yeah, and I mean, sometimes as a rhetorical slight. Last time this happened to me, like justify your preferences. I'm like, well, what is it that you're asking? Are you asking like a psychology question? Like, are you asking about why I have the psychology that I have? Because if you're doing that, are you credited? Like, are you, like, how much do you charge for your therapy session? Like, it's no longer a deep or a philosophical question when you're asking why I have the particular psychology that I have. It's yeah, I mean, you could always ask what kind of question do you think you're asking when you're asking justify your preferences, at least your fundamental ones. Because like I said, values can come from other values, but it doesn't go ad infinitum.
Right. I think this point about the psychological, like, because I think that my moral standards, like you said, I could give a causal explanation for why I have the standards and values that I have. I'm not going to give some sort of like normative justification because that's the very thing I'm rejecting. So demanding that I provide one and then saying, there's a problem with your view if you don't provide it is not an appropriate type of objection, because that's one of the points under contention. It would be question begging to like declare or begin the discussion by saying you must have a normative justification for the specific normative content of your moral standards, or else there's a problem with your standards. Like you must offer me some sort of philosophical like argument for why those standards are like the good ones. If my whole point is that I don't think that there's anything like that, it's a little weird to demand that. So if a person asking the question does get clear, often it's just not clear what people are asking. It's like they're using the sneer words to make your position look bad, but it's also so underspecified and unclear what they're saying that it's just like your position is smelly, and then it's like you don't even know what exactly they're asking. If they clarify and it's a causal explanation, and they're like, no, I just want the causal explanation. Why is it that you have those values instead of some others' values? Yeah, sure, go ahead. I want you to tell me the causal story there. Now, okay, Danny, what's your favorite color?
Probably green.
Do you know why it's your favorite color?
I've been told why. I don't even know if it's true. I've been something about green being a very important color spectrum to human beings, but I don't know why. I really don't.
So you don't have no justification. You don't even know the answer.
I guess I'm
irrational. You don't even know. You don't even know. So you're going around saying, I like green. It's my favorite color. And you don't even know why. Oh my God. That's what people will then try to do if you do go the causal route, is they'll imply that, if I like, for instance, I'm against, because I'm always giving this example, like baby torture. I'm against baby torture. If someone says why, I can be like, well, I don't want people to harm babies. Like I'm against harm. It makes me upset, and I care about other people, and I don't want them to suffer. They could just say, okay, but that's just more fundamental normative values you have. Why do you have those? That's how my brain is. I don't know, because I wasn't brought up to think differently, and like evolution and emotions. Like what? I don't know. What do they want? A comprehensive account of human cognition? Like what the hell are they looking for? And why can't I just say, I don't know? That's how I am. Is there?
That goes back to your point. That goes back to your point, because there is a rhetorical issue. Like if you say, I don't know why I prefer, like let's just take some like what would they say, like some horrible example. I don't know exactly. Well, I mean, usually it boils down to something like, I don't know why I prefer to harm this person rather than to help them. Like I mean that a lot of people are not very comfortable saying that, but so there are going to be certain preferences that are so linked to a kind of sense of morality. So it puts us in a weird position to say, oh, well, I don't know why I prefer to help the lady across the street rather than push her into the street. Like I mean, but yeah. So you have to. It is a bit of a when it comes to the examples that they give in moral dilemmas, right? Do you think that there's a certain way that that we could present ourselves without saying, I don't know why I prefer to help people rather than to harm people?
The conversations rarely go in that direction. I'd have to like sit down and really think like what rhetorically is the best way to answer that question that is both consistent with the position and doesn't just play into the hand of the trap that's being laid for you. So what I think you need to do in a lot of these cases where people are asking these sort of trappy rhetorical questions is that you need a good way of exposing the nature of the trap itself. You need oftentimes to go meta. What I can say about that is, in the case of normative entanglement, this, for me, when I came up with the idea, it was speculative for quite a while, but I did run an empirical study on this. And what I did is I just directly asked people to examine a conversation. And the conversation actually used the exact wording I'm always using, where so you have one person say to another person, hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? And then I created 3 conditions, and the people in the study were randomly assigned to one of those conditions. And trust me, this is relevant to your question. In one condition, the person says, yes, I think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun. And in the next condition, they say, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun. Now let's pause there. What I then did, so you have those 2 scenarios. So you have Alex says, is it objectively wrong to torture babies? And then Sam says, yes, it is. Or Sam says, no, it isn't. And then I asked people in those 2 scenarios to judge Sam, the person responding to the question. How do you think they judged the character of Sam between the 2 conditions?
Sorry. So Sam was the one that what?
So one person says to another, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? And then Sam either responds by saying, yes, it is objectively wrong, or no, it's not objectively wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask the participants, what do you think about Sam? The person that
Oh,
either
when they
says yes or
if
they
were
say
to
no.
say no.
Yeah, and then I ask questions like how much would you like trust Sam? How likable is Sam? How good of a person is Sam? How likely is Sam to be okay with baby torture? That sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
Yeah, I
remember
mean-
the exact questions off the top of my head. This was like a
Yeah,
long time ago.
if they're responding that no, I don't think it's objectively wrong, they would probably have some kind of level of disapproval, right? Because it's not
A what? Sorry.
some level of disapproval or distrust.
Oh yeah, they don't
Yeah.
like that person as much. So
Mhm.
if you compare character evaluations in terms of like positive character traits, the person that says yes is judged more positively than the person that says no. Here's where things get interesting. I included a third condition, and this is a third. You could call it like a Gricean cancellation condition. No reason to get into what exactly I mean by that. But basically, what the person is going to do in this condition is they say no, but they say no. But that's because I don't think anything is objectively wrong. I do think that baby torture is morally wrong. In fact, I find it deeply repugnant, horrible, and awful, and I'd want to stop people that try to do it. Now compare the three. Do people judge that third person more like the person that says yes without qualification or no without qualification? What do you think?
Well, they would want qualification, right?
So you have
Yeah.
three conditions. Sorry to spring this on you.
Yeah, that's fine. It's fine.
So you have three conditions. And the question is, do they see the person positively or negatively? Just to simplify it. They're asked, the person is asked, is it objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? Person says yes. Are they perceived positively or negatively?
Negatively, right?
They'd be seen positively.
Oh, maybe I misheard you. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let's go through it slowly.
Okay,
I know
my
I talk
bad.
fast. Okay. One person asks another person, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun?
And they
The
replied,
first person says, yes, it's objectively wrong.
"Oh,
Is
okay."
that person
They
seen
would
positively or negatively?
Okay, yeah, they would.
Okay. The next person says, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong. Positively or negatively?
No, they don't.
Yeah. Are they seen as is that person seen as positively or negatively by the
Negatively.
participants?
The second
Yeah.
person.
Now the third person says, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong, but I do find it repugnant, horrible, and awful, and morally wrong. I just don't think anything's objectively wrong. I'm opposed to it, and I'd want to stop people.
They would see way more positively, the third person way more positively than the second person.
Yep. So you see, it's not about the meta-ethical position you take. Because the meta-ethical position isn't driving people's evaluations. What's driving their evaluations is the attitude that's implied about the person's stance towards the issue. If the person says, yes, I'm opposed to it, clearly they're against it. If the person says, no, it's not objectively wrong, it kind of seems like maybe they're just not opposed to baby torture. But if a person says no, and then they have this like, it's because I disagree with this objective word there, but I really do find it wrong and awful and horrible and bad and no good, and I really am against it. That is erasing all of the concern that people would have had with them simply saying no. And it brings them back to the point of being very similar to the person that says yes. So what that does, and I'd like to replicate this and run variations on this, what this shows is, empirically speaking, if you actually give participants in a study these types of scenarios, that normative entanglement will occur in real time. People will think that a person that just says no is some awful monster. But if the person is able to qualify their statements appropriately, then they're no longer seen as so awful. That's important. Okay. And that what that shows is that there's, I think, a rhetorical element underlying these types of accusations. And note, we started the video off before we got to this point talking about that, and you can see hints of similar sorts of things emerging in these videos. There's this subtle indication that there's something nasty and bad about anti-realism.
Okay, so
sorry, that was a lot.
That's fine. That's
share
fine.
any thoughts you have, and then we can continue.
Well, I mean, the thought here, at least with the video, was the last thing that I wanted to leave off on was the arbitrary thing. But I think we've adequately, I guess, like to the question I had originally asked, if someone doesn't know, I mean, you can just give a really broad explanation. You could say, well, it could be an evolutionary explanation. It could be a sociological explanation if you take those to be distinct. You know, it could be the way I was raised. I mean, that you could just go for the narrative explanation and point out that they're to ask the normative for a normative explanation is to raise the question of whether there is, if it's an intelligible question, right? So But yeah, so we're going to continue with the video, right? Okay.
Arbitrarily changing morality. Fisher explains this by saying, if there is progress, this seems to imply that we are somehow moving closer to the truth of how the world actually ought to be. But if moral realism is false, then it seems that there could be no standard or benchmark, and it is hard to see why we would think moral progress was possible at all. Just like science is advancing us closer to finding out the theory of how the universe works, moral progress is advancing us in finding out what is morally true. If we think progress is being made, or we are encouraging moral progress, then we imply moral realism is true. This is also backed up by moral convergence. A common argument used against moral realism is the fact that cultures disagree on what morality is. Certain sects of Islam agree that it is okay to enslave women, and certain African tribes believe it is okay to murder deformed infants. Certain fundamentalist groups do not think it is right for us to take medication when we're sick. Therefore, morality seems to be defined by the culture. But that is not really an argument against moral realism. In the same way, the fact that different cultures have different views on the shape of the earth, that doesn't mean science is subjective, and there is no objective shape of the earth that we can study and learn about.
Can you pause?
And second,
I'll just say very quickly that I agree with this. I've never taken the mere fact of observable differences in like non-philosophers' moral standards and attitudes as some kind of good evidence that realism is false. For the obvious reason that people disagree on like scientific facts and other sorts of facts, and
Right.
that doesn't mean that like scientific facts aren't objectively true. It's just it's never been a good argument. Actual arguments from disagreement have to do. Well, I shouldn't say actual. These are actual arguments. They're just not very good ones, and I agree with realists that these aren't good ones. But why go after such bad arguments? The stronger arguments are going to turn on stuff like epistemic peers, and it's going to be like, what happens when you have people that are equally well positioned to actually know the answer and they still disagree? And that's going to be a much bigger issue. Now, if you just point to the standards of people all over the world and they happen to disagree about moral issues, not a big deal. But imagine that scientists have access to pretty much all plausible data that they could reasonably have access to. They're using the same methods. They appear equally competent and all that. And so, and yet you get like a 50-50 split on an issue. You've got a problem there.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that realism about the issue isn't true, but that's a trickier problem to deal with than like disagreement among random people that are not using some shared method or anything.
That makes sense. Yeah, I agree. This is not a very good definition of realism.
cultural differences on morality are not typically real moral differences, but factual differences. For example, these radical Islamic extremists do not believe women have souls, therefore it is okay to oppress them. They do not think slavery of what they call human is right. They merely have an underlying factual error in their thinking, which transfers to their moral ideas. Certain African tribes do not think it is actually good to murder infants, but think deformed infants are possessed by evil spirits or actually are evil spirits. They have factual errors, which cause them to act as they do. It is their beliefs about the facts, not morality, that causes them to think what ought to be done.
It's interesting that he's pointing this out, but he doesn't offer this as how many moral disputes are come about, right? I mean, which is something that we said in the first video that we had, but this is one of our explanations for why how you could understand a moral dispute is actually just a dispute about the non-moral facts. So
I agree with the general point being made here. I don't know about the specifics of the examples being given. I don't know if any of those particular claims are true. They may or may not be. And I'm not about to start like fact checking specific claims about whether these groups actually think the things that he's claiming. But yeah, I suspect that a lot of apparent moral disagreement is really disagreement about non-moral facts. I think it's a good point, but I think that point ends up cutting both ways for both for and against realists, depending on what it is, the specific thing you're dealing with. The other thing I would just emphasize is that the degree to which, as a matter of like practice, what proportion of moral disagreements are attributable to disagreements about non-moral facts, that is an empirical question. We don't actually know the answer to that. It could turn out that if we really dug in and examined, like we did a bunch of anthropological and cross-cultural psychological research, we could turn out to find lots of really intractable fundamental disagreements in moral standards, or we could find almost none. I don't know the answer to that. I know that there's people that work on that, but it's not going to be the sort of thing that I think has been decisively resolved at present. So who knows what the answer to that is. That's going to be a tough question to answer.
So in reality, when given factual clarification, cultures tend to widely agree on basic moral facts. If you convince a tribe that a neighboring rival tribe is of the same human family as they are, they tend to change their views on if they should be killed off or not. A lot of moral progress has resulted from adjusting underlying factual errors, not changing moral views. So in reality, once factual errors are corrected or overlooked, morality in different cultures converges. Fisher says, imagine we put 50 people from around the world in individual rooms and ask them to think up the 10 most important moral rules. Again, I suspect there will be a large amount of convergence. For example, they all might write that it is wrong to steal, or wrong to kill children, or wrong to enslave people. Although the list would not be identical, there would certainly be much overlap. A good reason would be that there really are certain moral properties, and that they have been recognized by the people in the rooms.
Pause there. Yeah, so this is not very compelling. If I took people from 50 different people from around the world, and I put them in a room and I said, hey, write down the 10 like sort of basic ingredients in food that you consider tasty, you're going to get stuff like fat, sugar, oils, grains of various kinds, salt. Would there be any society that wouldn't put salt on that list? Probably. I think almost certainly not. It might be, you might have actually a lot more convergence on the basics of what makes food good than you do on moral values. And like moral values have changed a lot over the course of human history. Have taste preferences? I suspect not as much. And so what then we can ask, like, what's the best explanation for that? So we do this abductive reasoning. Like, what's the best explanation for why it turns out people from all over the world would have similar fundamental like taste preferences? That explanation is going to be a causal one. It's going to appeal to facts about their shared evolutionary history, the fact that we're members of the same species. We have similar sorts of brains. We have almost identical, DNA. It's not like we're dealing with a bunch of radically different organisms. Dogs and cats and birds and trees aren't going to prefer the same sustenance as humans do, but we're all super psychologically similar to one another. So that would explain why we have the same food preferences. So then look at our normative standards. We're almost identical. Would it be a surprise if evolution and our shared cultural history influence the fact that we have similar underlying standards and values, but that, in different parts of the world, the non-moral facts ended up being very different from one another? Again, not really. We share similar, our brain structures are almost identical. The emotional centers in the brain are going to work the same. We have the shared. Yeah, I'm belaboring the point.
Yeah,
the bottom line is we're really similar to one another. Why would we not have similar preferences and values?
There's also sociological proximity. That's very important. Like the reason why everyone's going to freak out if we were to see something like on the movie Independence Day, a big spaceship hover over New York City, right? We're going to freak out because it's foreign in a way where they could have any set of norms. Like they have norms to help us, they could have norms to eat us. And given that they're so detached from our sociological proximity, it's scary. I think that people like Fisher and IP shouldn't be worried then if they want to be consistent of if there were alien agents and they hover and they put a big spaceship above over New York City. Well, convergence, guys. We don't have. We're likely okay. I know I would be freaking out because they're from a galaxy far, far away, and who knows what their normative views are.
Those aliens are going to have a shared history that is radically different from our own, and so a realist might think, well, hey, look, if they have the technology to get here, they've had a lot of time to figure out what the facts are. And it'd be really strange if they figured out the mathematical facts and the engineering facts and the chemistry facts, but they didn't figure out the moral facts. So yeah, they probably figured out the moral facts. And so they're going to think things like it's wrong to kill other people. It's wrong to eat people. And then we go and talk to these aliens and they're like, yeah, we came here to eat all of you. We're just here to eat you. And we have a giant intergalactic deep fryer and we're just going to cook you up and eat you like French fries. and we brought space ketchup, and it's going to be awesome. We invited a few other aliens to our barbecue. You guys are screwed. There's no hope of survival. And then they just start barbecuing us. And we're like, what are realists going to do? Like say, but that's objectively wrong in my intuitions. It's one thing I pointed out about realists appealing to their intuitions. You could imagine a scenario like Star Trek or something, or some science fiction scenario where we're part of an intergalactic federation of like a million different alien civilizations. Imagine if moral realists from Earth showed up and said, these are the normative moral facts because that's the intuitions that we have. And like every other species in the entire galaxy was like, none of us have exactly those intuitions. Like one is like, oh, mine are really similar. I have 9 out of 10. So they all have different intuitions. What would the realists from Earth do? Just say, yeah, our intuitions are the reliable ones? Why would they think that their brains happen to get it right? And then the 999,999 other species, none of them, they didn't evolve correctly or something. It'd be really weird. And so I think that philosophers that are appealing to their own intuitions have a kind of culturally blinkered, like a really parochial view where they mostly talk to and interact with one another. They don't talk to people in the distant past. Like if we went back 1,000 or 1,500 or 3,000 years ago and shared the same normative intuitions, it's self-evidently obvious that people are this way and you should treat people this way. They could go around to talking to all the smartest, most well-educated philosophers at the time, and they'd be like, the hell are you talking about? None of that is true. That's ridiculous. It's self-evident that it's okay to. And then they could just list off all these things we would consider horrific. And I mean, the whole thing just strikes me as really, really strange. But the bottom line, just to get back to what's being stated in the video, a good reason would be that there are certain moral properties and that they have been recognized by the people in the rooms. What's the argument for that? What's the good reason to think that? So just again, go back to the food comparison, and we could make this point stronger. Now, in the world with the modern globalization and trade and like global economies, and it's easy to fly things and transport things in boats now. All over the world, there's like McDonald's is all over the place. People wear blue jeans everywhere. Coca-Cola is everywhere. McDonald's is everywhere. People love very similar food, like almost anywhere you go. If I travel to another country, I would be surprised if I couldn't find French fries. Like I'm just going to find French fries. Every country I've ever been to, there's been French fries, and I've eaten them. So like foods have traveled, like, and potatoes weren't originally all over the world. So what we've seen is culinary convergence. Would it make sense to say that because there's been so much convergence in culinary practices, a good reason would be that there really are certain gastronomic properties and that they've been recognized by people in the rooms? That seems silly. That's a ridiculous
Out
thing.
of curiosity, Lance, have you ever had someone that said, yeah, I'm a gastronomic realist?
Yes. Yeah. So I have had people where, it's like, what's the stupid phrase? One philosopher's modus ponens is another's modus tollens. So I've presented gastronomic realism as a kind of reductio or a comparison to show how, look, the same kinds of considerations, and that's what I'm doing here. What I'm pointing out here is that if this is a good argument for moral realism, it's also a good argument for gastronomic realism. That's silly. So maybe we should reconsider whether this is a good argument for moral realism. The other point I would just make, generally speaking, is that we have better explanations for why there's been moral convergence. A better explanation for why there's been convergence in people's moral standards around the world is that there's been greater cultural interaction between people around the world. And people have become, like, the global conditions have become more similar over time. People are less, their values and standards and beliefs. I'm like, look, just take the spread of Christianity all over the world. So there's been specific systems that have a strong moral component that's like fundamental to them, and they've been spread all over the world. Oh my gosh, all the people that are subscribing to those are more similar to one another now. That's an indication that their values are true. Why is it an indication that when you convince people to share your standards, that they share your standards? What the heck? If I went around, like, imagine there was a group of people that said everyone's got to wear a purple hat, and they traveled all over the place, and they persuaded some people very nicely to wear purple hats. They had lots of kids, and all their kids, they were wearing purple hats from the time they were born. And then other people, they said, wear purple hats or we'll kill you all. Take your pick on how the spread of purple hat wearing practices proceed, which is, reflecting how Christianity is spread in the world. So then you look at the world and you see it in the year 1000, and it's 20% of the world wears purple hats, and you see it in the world 2000 and 70% of the world wears purple hats. Is that an indication that it's objectively good to wear a purple hat? No, there's a causal explanation for the spread of purple hat wearing. And it's the same thing with moral standards. It's not like these standards. Here's another consideration. Imagine we end up in like a Mad Max situation where there's a big apocalypse. Do you think moral standards would just proceed as normal? Because I don't. I think we'd quickly go back to like very different moral standards that would be like adapted to the conditions that people will be living in. Just the point here is that as societies become more homogenous, they interact more, some of them impose their standards and values on others to a greater extent. There's nothing surprising about the people being more similar when they interact more. Just consider, here's another, I'm going to give several intuition pumps for this point. Imagine there's two civilizations of people living side by side, but there's a big impassable mountain range between them. And imagine this is like 5,000 years ago, early agriculture. They can't really get through the mountains. They only have like copper or bronze tools. They don't really have the technology. And they've been separated, for over 100,000 years. The culture, the languages would be completely different. The cultures would be different. The practices would be different. The style of clothing, the way they prepare food. There's going to be all kinds of differences between them. Now, there's actually going to be similarities because their environments are similar. And that's another point about human similarities is it's not just our shared evolutionary history. We're also in similar environments. You can imagine if people were colonizing Mars or something, that they would quickly start developing culture, very different culture, and that the more similar your environmental conditions, the more similar your culture. So
have you
set
seen
aside
the series The Expanse? That's what I'm reminded. The Martians.
I've watched 2 or 3 episodes. I haven't finished it up, but that's a good example where you quickly get like lunar culture and stuff. People start diverging pretty quickly. So that probably would happen because people's cultures adapt to the situations that they're in. So now imagine they either develop the technology. Let's just say there's a big earthquake and it creates a big canyon that opens. It's a big, wide. It's like 500 meters wide between the two civilizations, and they finally, after 100,000 years, can start interacting with one another. Now, imagine how different they would be given that separation. Then the canyon forms, and they could start interacting with one another, and they do. Right at that point, let's say you were rating how different they were on a scale of 1 through 10. I'd say, let's say the differences would be like an 8 or a 9. Now you come back 50 years later. Is it still going to be, let's say, an 8? No, maybe it's down to a 7. What happens when you come back 1,000 years later? Would you be surprised if there's only one culture now? Would you be surprised, Danny? No, because they're interacting with one another. Maybe one culture conquers the other. Maybe they all have kids together and the practices blend until they're indistinguishable. The point would be, when people interact, they are more likely on average to become more similar than when they don't interact. And so we're looking at a modern society where over time, technology has caused people to interact more. Is it any surprise that people have become more similar over time? No. So we can explain moral convergence for the same reason we can explain gastronomic convergence. Prior to people shipping potatoes all over the world, of course, people all over the world weren't cooking potatoes. Once it was available, potatoes are really easy to fry. They're very delicious when you fry them. So people are going to start doing it because they have shared underlying preferences. Just the point here is that we have really straight, and there's a bunch of things to say about the explanations I'm proposing. The explanations I'm proposing appeal to nothing more than mundane facts in psychology, sociology, anthropology, psychology that are already readily available to us. They're completely mundane and they don't invoke any special properties. They at least enjoy much greater parsimony. Whereas here we have an explanation where here's a good explanation. We're going to propose entirely otherwise, like these novel entities to explain these changes. Why do you need to propose that? Imagine in that culture situation I gave, if you had to propose like, cultural particles that are inducing people to become more similar, even though they did, like, why? If sociology and history and psychology and anthropology can explain it, you don't need to propose any of that stuff. So this is not a good reason. This is a bad explanation. And it's a bad explanation until someone can show what's inadequate or defective about the kinds of explanation.
All right. You cut out there for a split second for me, but
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
sorry
good.
about that. I just said I'm just concluding. It's not a good explanation. Do you have anything to add to that?
No. We can continue.
Let's keep going. Let's finish this up and
So
then
when
we can answer
factual differences are resolved, moral beliefs do seem to converge, supporting the idea there are objective moral facts we humans are discovering and verifying through moral progress.
Just pause here.
Finally, building on all these
Can
previous...
you bring it back to the argument just so we could say decisively what the problem with this is? play it just so we get the whole argument on the there. So if we're looking at this, I would just say, one, why? Okay, so I would just reject premise one.
Yeah, I wonder if his the nuance in the bottom means anything.
I'm not saying this is proof. Oh, that goes with that remark that he make a remark earlier in the video about proof.
Yeah.
That was a little strange. Yeah.
He's saying this is just a piece of cumulative case of all. I mean, I don't know how to respond to that.
Yeah, I would just reject premise one. What about you?
Yeah, that premise one. I think I would say two is true. And there is moral progress is possible. And
right now, here's the problem with this is one of those problems where it's ambiguous in a way that's similar to normative entanglement.
Mhm.
What if moral progress or convergence, we explicitly stipulated stance independent? So if moral realism is false, stance independent moral progress and convergence would not be possible. Now that's true, right? And so then you would just say you would have to reject premise two.
Right.
So the problem with an argument like this is that whether you can't just say I reject premise one, because then they could stipulate something like no, you can't reject premise one because by moral progress I mean stance independent progress. That's ridiculous. So then you would have to reject premise two, and then they could say, wait, so you're saying there's no such thing as progress? And you could be like, no, I think there's progress, just not stance independent progress. Oh, so you agree with premise one? No, I don't agree with that. So you see the problem with why not being explicit in your premises is a problem. This argument is ambiguous. And what I would say about it is that conditional on whether moral progress and convergence is understood to be constitutively stance independent. If it is, then I reject premise two. If it's not, then I reject premise one.
Right, which is why, I mean, maybe I should clarify. Like, that's why I would use the terms moral, but whether it's conceptually there, and that's kind of the kind of entanglement stuff going on. And but yeah, I mean, if someone says, is it wrong? Yeah, I would say it's wrong. But given the kind of conversation we're in, a metaethical one, you probably don't mean what I mean, or, so, but that goes, I'm just kind of repeating what you're saying. Should we continue?
Yep.
Finally, building on all these previous arguments, we have to remember moral realism is intuitive. Moral facts and duties are simply self-evident and intuitive.
Pause.
If we see a child getting...
Yeah, so so the claim is that moral realism is intuitive. People already know what I'm going to say about that. Intuitive to who? It's not intuitive to me. So you get these strange claims from philosophers where they'll say something is intuitive. That also, I don't know if I'd say it's ambiguous, but it's not very clear what that means. If you're saying something is intuitive, it's a bit like saying chocolate is tasty. Now, are you saying it's tasty in an unqualified way, like it's stance independently tasty? Because I don't know what that would mean. And in the case of intuitive, we're not talking about realism or anti-realism here. We're talking about a psychological state that I don't know how to talk about unless we're indexing it or making a more specific claim. This would be a sensible thing to say. Most people or most humans find realism intuitive, or most people that engage in appropriate philosophical reflection using acceptable epistemic norms would, on reflection, find moral realism intuitive, or most professional analytic philosophers find moral realism intuitive. Like, you could specify the claim where it becomes like substantive enough for us to evaluate the claim. But when it's underspecified and unqualified in that way, I don't know what the claim is. I don't find it intuitive. So, like, is Michael Jones saying that he finds it intuitive? Because, like, if so, that's a lot weaker of a claim than a claim about some statistical claim about some proportion of people who find it intuitive.
Yeah, and I would say not only do I not find it, not that it's not intuitive, but it's unintuitive. Like, I have the intuition going the opposite way. At least I would say that. I mean, it's true.
Yeah, I'm wary of intuition talk, but it seems false to me. But then also he adds self-evident. That's an even stronger claim, is it not?
Yeah,
I mean, not just that moral realism is intuitive, but that it's self-evident. Whoa. I
feel like when people say X is like something is self-evident, that's just a big, like, screw you. It's like if you're in a discussion with someone that disagrees with you and you say, well, it's just self-evident. I just feel like they don't even want to talk about it. Like, that's like, okay, well, like, it's just, Where does that get us? Okay, it's self-evident. I'm going to say it's
because
self-evident
what if I
going the
said
other way.
the truth of anti-realism is self-evident?
Yeah, I mean, what do you do now?
Because
What do
like,
you do?
look, if I'm reporting my actual phenomenology, there's almost nothing that's more obvious to me than that it doesn't make sense to talk about values and standards other than in an indexicalized or stance dependent way. It's like almost because like I think and talk about this much more than other topics. I don't like it's the most obvious thing to me that of almost anything I could think of. So if there were candidates for self-evidence, that would be one of them. So what if I just walk it into the meta ethics philosophy conference? You know, I present a paper. The paper says anti-realism is self-evident. Fuck you. Like what? Now what? If someone disputes, no, we're not entertaining your dispute. It's self-evidently true. So what is there to dispute? You're wrong. It's like it is simply revealed to us that anti-realism is true. Yeah. Like they're going to do the same thing I do when they talk about realism being self-evident. They're going to that hasn't been revealed to me. What the hell? And I'd say, what am I going to do? I can make all the moves that the realist could make. I could say, well, the people that think correctly about the actual experts that have looked at this don't think that, like I could make all those points. Now, what they could say is, but if you look at the Phil paper survey, there's more of us than there are of you. I mean, one, that gets split up into naturalists and non-naturalists. And two, then I could still question whether those people are appropriate experts. Like how many of those people might be methodologically compromised because of existing commitments or values or adopting norms and standards that I don't agree with. I could start saying, okay, well, we got to cut this group out because they endorse this view, or they got to cut that group out because they endorse that view. So like there is ample grounds for someone to make a sort of converse statement, and it's unclear what principles, tools, or resources we could appeal to show that one side is decisively on better footing.
Getting tortured. None of us would think that is simply how other people see the world and we should move on. No, we all feel that must be stopped and justice should be done. But
no, we all think that must be stopped, I think he said, and justice should be done. Again, this is a conflation between meta-ethical considerations and normative considerations. I agree that shouldn't be done and it should be stopped. I agree that people that torture children should be stopped and that it's awful and repugnant and terrible and bad. I just don't think it stands independently awful, terrible, and bad, because I think that's like saying it's magically bad. You know, this is a point I wanted to make before when I was talking about like the beans. You know, a good way of illustrating how silly the kind of normative entanglement situation to be is if someone came up to you and said, do you think it's magically bad to torture babies or whatever? And if you say no, they're like, oh my God, you think it's okay to torture babies? You're like, no. It's totally bad to torture babies. There's just nothing magical about that. That's the kind of scenario that I find myself in. And again, there's an implication here that if you're an anti-realist, you're like not against torture and stuff. It's just so absurd. But I've made that point like 100 times already. So let's keep going.
But why? Because the idea moral facts and duties are real and objective is self-evident and is our intuitive starting point. See, the burden is on the skeptic to show that our intuitions are wrong, not the moral realist.
It's our intuitive starting point. Why is it my intuitive starting point? You see, now there's this like dialectical creep, right? It's one thing to say realism is intuitive to me. It's another to say it's intuitive. It's another to say it's intuitive to us. Who is us? Who is our? Who is included in this? No, again, though, no argument is shown here to demonstrate that it's intuitive to me or to Danny or to any of us. It's simply asserted. There's just a statement. This is our intuitive starting point. Where is the argument for that? Where is the demonstration that that's true? The answer is it's not here. This has not been demonstrated. I don't grant that it's intuitive. I don't grant that it's our intuitive starting point. And I don't grant that there's a presumption in favor of realism. So I outright deny that I have any special burden here. I just don't accept that. What's the argument for that? Again, we're not given one.
Right.
So even if I didn't have any other arguments for moral realism, this point on intuition would remain. It is the skeptic that bears the burden of proof in this instance to show us our intuitive starting point is wrong. This is the point many philosophers make, theists and atheists alike. Richard Boyd says, in the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observations, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. We test general moral principles and moral theories by seeing how their consequences conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases. David Brink says, our moral thinking and discourse might be systematically mistaken.
You said pause it?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Can we go back to the Boyd quote?
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, it appears that in moral reasoning, moral intuition, it's like saying it appears that in moral reasoning, moral appearances play the same. I mean, it's just like, I get that. That would, there's some. Why would it appear that way? That there's some kind of parallel between what's going on in science, and what's going on in the disputes in metaethics.
Right.
So
So we, like a biologist or a chemist might observe some like thing in a petri dish or in a microscope, or like just walking outside with binoculars and seeing some event take place, right? And then there's some observation, and then if there's two or more scientists, we're agreeing, we're both seeing it, and we need to explain it. Now, if you want to make that comparison to moral intuitions, okay, so you have an intuition, I have an intuition. First of all, if we're talking about normative moral intuitions, where does the realism come in there? Because we can explain normative intuitions and work through them and talk about them and try to reach reflective equilibrium and developing consistent normative standards without doing any metaethics. Like, we don't need to do that. For the same reason, I don't need to do that when I'm talking about like my taste preferences. Like, I don't have to presume realism. So already, like, which moral intuitions are we talking about? If we're talking about normative moral intuitions, it's not so clear to me that we're going to get much metaethical traction out of that. If we're talking about realist intuitions, now I'm going to want to see the data on that. So, okay, so some people have realist intuitions and some people don't. This is not like a scientific dispute where we're both agreeing that there's like there's a particular star and we want to know what the chemical composition of the star is. So we use methods to figure it out. It's not like we both agree Mars exists and we want to know whether there was life on Mars or not. This is not a case where we're agreeing on what's being observed, and then the question is how to explain it. The only thing that we agree on is that realists have realist intuitions. That's it. And so our data is, it seems to some people that realism is true. Now the question is how to explain that. What I'm not granting is that if it seems to most of us that we have certain normative moral intuitions, we need to bring in realism to explain that. Bullshit. I don't grant that. And if we're saying some people, let's even say it's 60, 70% of philosophers have realist intuitions, and some we don't know the answer because we haven't done enough empirical research. Non-philosophers may or may not have these intuitions. Then the question is, how do we explain those intuitions? And the anti-realist is well within the purview of what would be appropriate philosophically to say, here's an explanation. They're wrong. Like, the world is not as they're representing it. They are mistaken. They could propose some type of error theory for the psychological disposition to judge that realism seems true. So anti-realists can explain this by saying people for whom it seems realism is true are wrong. So like that should be on the table at least.
Conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases. David Brink says, our moral thinking and discourse might be systematically mistaken, but this would be a revisionary conclusion, to be accepted only as a result of extended and compelling argument that the commitments of ethical objectivity.
Yeah, our moral thinking and discourse might be systematically mistaken. I mean, like, an anti-realist could think that.
Right. So first of all, notice, I don't know if these quotes are just not giving enough flesh to what the philosophers are saying, but outside their context, these statements are just kind of obscure. They're not great remarks to work with outside the context and whatever text they appeared in, or remarks, or like surrounding remarks. But like, our moral thinking and discourse might be systematically mistaken. Yeah, as you said, consistent with anti-realism. What else did you have to say?
Yeah, well, no, that's the first thing. I mean, like, it's just, again, there's that entanglement issue. The term mistaken. That's all I really. I mean, but this would be a revisionary conclusion. I mean, okay, to be accepted only as the result of extended and compelling argument that the commitments of ethical objectivity are unsustainable.
Right. So notice here, the presumption behind our moral thinking might be is that our moral thinking is realist. And so the claim seems to be something like, we think like realists. So if you want to reject realism, you're going to need good reasons to override how you're disposed to think. But I'm not granting that we think like realists. What you'll notice here with Boyd, with Brink, with Michael Jones, is that there's a presumption that like there's a shared default way of thinking, and that's a realist way of thinking. I don't grant that. And I almost never see any anti-realists argue against this.
Yeah.
But a few things to say about this. There has been survey data from the 2020 Phil Paper survey on professional philosophers. What you see from that is that you get something like 62% endorsing moral realism. Now, that's actually about evenly split with a slightly higher percentage of naturalist realists compared to non-naturalist realists. Now, those views are very, very different. I don't want to get into that now. And then you have about 1/4 give anti-realist responses. And then the remainder is like they pick other, like they pick a variety of different positions that don't fall into that dichotomy. Now, who is our? Is it only that 62%? Is everyone else excluded? Like what? That seems a little strange. Now that, the realists might say, no. Most of the anti-realists find realism intuitive, but then they reject it anyway. So they've gone through this process here. They think they have compelling arguments for overriding their realist intuitions. Maybe so. But part of my concern here is that we have not established that most people think this way. And my own work, I specialize in the psychology of metaethics. I think the empirical evidence does not show that most people think like moral realists. And the best available evidence we have has actually found that at least among US college students, they had a majority anti-realist response using the best methods that have been devised so far. Now, is that super compelling? No, I'm not going to go to, rely on US college students in particular in these samples as evidence about how everybody everywhere thinks. But realists are just helping themselves to a presumption if they think most people think like realists. They have not, that's an empirical claim, and they have not established that claim is true. Now, if they want to point to most philosophers are realists, well, most philosophers in analytic philosophy probably weren't realists 50 years ago. And that already shows a kind of like, maybe they think we've made massive progress in the last 50 years. I think that this is showing recent fashions and trends in the field. That's a hard case to make. But just like this presumption, I think, is questionable. We need to be asking, well, what's the psychological origins of why realists think like realists? And how do we discount people like myself? Like, why am I mistaken? Why am I obliged to accept that what most of them think, that there's a presumption in their favor? I don't think that they've really done the work to show that there is a strong presumption in favor of realism. You have a group of philosophers who are an extremely insular, narrow group of academics that all talk to one another. They go to the same universities, they read the same books, they train in the same canon. Most of them are from the same culture. Even if they're not from that culture, they work in that culture. They write in English, they work in English, they read a bunch of work in English. This is a tiny, insular, highly homogenous group of people who are cut off from the rest of the world in terms of how they think. They are super psychologically idiosyncratic, and we're expected to think that the way that tiny group of people thinks is representative of how everybody thinks? No, they haven't shown that. Or we're supposed to think that the way they think illustrates some sort of broad expertise on the matter? No, they haven't shown that. So, I mean, this would be very similar to if like a Christian said, most of us recognize, a theologian said, most of us theologians recognize that God exists and that it's pretty obvious that God exists. And it'd be very hard to explain the world without appealing to God. And so if someone wants to deny the existence of God, there is a presumption in favor of God until you show otherwise. Now, that's a more extreme case, but I think an atheist could just say, well, hold up, why should I grant that theologians are the arbiters of what the default position is? And it's the same thing here. I think philosophy and contemporary analytic philosophy, which is almost entirely so that survey, the Phil Paper survey, about half of the participants were in the United States. It's like 48%. And when they're not, they're typically from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany. This is not representative of the world's population. And you get a group of people that are all very, very similar to one another. They all read the same stuff. Kant, Plato, Aristotle, Hume, they're reading the same stuff, and they start thinking similarly to one another. And I'm supposed to think that that's because they're all figuring out the truth and not because they're all inducted into and indoctrinated into thinking the same way. It's one or the other. I'm not sure which one, but you're not just entitled to treat yourselves as the arbiters on this. So I think we don't have the time to get into this, but there are massive issues about this. And I've written blog posts that cover this and done videos that cover this like really, really, really extensively. So I'll just refer you to those. You can check out my blog post, Generalizing from the Armchair. And then you could also check out a much longer one. It's a 9-part series that I wrote called The Phil Papers Fallacy, where I critique the kinds of presumptions that are similar to and underlying claims like this one here, where there's some presumption in favor of what most philosophers think or what most people think. I just don't buy these claims. I think they have tons of problems. And we can't get into all of them here, though.
All right.
Are unsustainable. In the meantime, we should treat the objectivity of ethics as a kind of default assumption or working hypothesis. This should also be obvious because we do this with every other topic. For example, we do not assume skepticism about our experience of the physical world unless we are given reason to. It is possible you are just a butterfly dreaming you are a human, but there is no good evidence to suggest it. So why accept a skeptical attack on intuition if there is no evidence to support it? Possibility is not probability. Likewise, we do not doubt our intuitive trust of our five senses unless we have a good reason to think that one of them has failed us. So why should we doubt our intuitive sense of moral fact?
It's just beyond me that the kind of more basic beliefs about the external, these like really big problems in philosophy, whether induction is reasonable or not, external world, like is it being compared to something like this, kind of boggles my mind. Why should we think that there's a parallel here between, why is it that the intuition that they're moral facts, like the intuition that there's an external world? I just don't see why there would be a relevant similarity.
I agree. And I also just need to stress again, this statement about like our, us. It keeps, who is our, who is us? Why not be specific? Why not be clear? I just don't understand why people are not clear about what they're saying. So that's one objection. The other is, let's just say that Michael Jones said, I'm talking about like realists, and maybe that's 60% of us. And we're justified in believing what seems true to us and our intuitions in the absence of defeaters, like some kind of phenomenal conservative kind of thing. Let's just say you are. Okay. And also, what's the phrase? Gooses and ganders. It's good for the goose. It's good for the same situation for me. Seems like that's not the case for me. So like we're in a parallel situation where, it seems to me that it's not the case. And so why should I doubt my intuitive sense that moral realism is false unless I'm given good reasons by realists to do so? So there's a parallel epistemic stance that we both stand in relation, like with respect to one another in relation to, where it seems like, imagine we're looking at an object, right? Just to make the sense comparison. It's not a good one, but let's just do it anyway. Seems to Mike Jones looks at the object, seems blue. I look at the object, seems red. Or like we could think of that, remember that stupid shirt that was like either gold and white or black and blue? So you look at that, seems black and blue to me, seems gold and white to someone else. Why should I think they're right and I'm wrong? Yeah. Like, unless they have good reasons to think they're right and I'm wrong. And so like, again, this to me is like, I don't know what I'm saying again, but it just seems to me dialectically inert if I don't share the intuition. Because if someone says, look, you and I both agree realism seems true, and so there's no good reason for you to doubt realism unless you've got the arguments against it. Even if I grant that, I don't grant that, but let's just say I granted that for the sake of argument, that it seems true to me and it seems true to you. That's going to be our starting point. And then if we wanted to override that point, we need good reasons to override that point. Fine. But it doesn't seem true to me. So now what? And I haven't seen realists do a good job of grappling with that, because so many of them just presume everybody shares their intuitions.
Facts, unless we are given good reason by moral non-realists to do so. So in this case, the burden is on the skeptic who wants to argue moral realism is false. Unless they can give us a good reason that female mutilation is not objectively wrong, or that our moral intuitions should be doubted, their argument is dead in the water. Likewise, neither should our experience, moral disagreement, moral progress and convergence, or epistemic duties favor concluding our intuitions on moral facts and duties are wrong. On the contrary, they only support our intuitive beliefs about morality. The skeptic has to mount an argument, not just assume the moral realist must bear the burden of proof.
The skeptic has to mount an argument. I don't see why we should. If the onset we're not even sure what it means to have an intuition of these these stance independent facts. Like,
yeah, there's so many questions we're jumping over here, but notice the strange thing here. Imagine a parallel case, and I've already alluded to this. Imagine if theists said, look, most people are theists. It seems like God exists to most of us. You could look at the world, it looks like it was designed, and it looks like it was created by a God. And so atheists have the burden of proof to show that God doesn't exist. Now, I find the whole thing weird because, like, as if there's a fact of the matter about who has the burden of proof, and like whoever is in the group of people that is denying the shared standard that seems true to everyone, or that person has the burden of proof, or they're the less common position. So if 60% of people, it seems like God exists, and you're in the 40% it doesn't, then you have the burden of proof. If it's one of those claims, it's really weird. Like, you have the burden of proof. What does that mean? I don't even, like, it's just the whole idea of this burden of proof stuff. Like, burdens of proof to me only makes sense to be handled like sociologically. Like, if we're in a debate, like, hey, do you want to take the burden of proof? No, I don't want to today. Okay, I'll take the burden of proof. Like, everybody's got a burden of proof, and they don't have a burden of proof, depending on what your conversational goals are. There's no objective fact of the matter here. So what if a skeptic says, yeah, I don't really care enough about this. I want to go watch TV. Like, are they making an error? Because like, what? Because, well, you're not shouldering your burden of proof. What if they're like, yeah, but I don't want to though. Like, just what the hell? Like, so there's that point. And then the other point is, realists are claiming that there's these facts. And then they're saying, it seems to us that there are these facts. And so we don't have the burden of proof because we're entitled to presume that what seems to us is true, unless you could show it's not true. And to do. So so imagine this situation, right? I give this example all the time, but in fact, actually, yeah, I'll just give this example. I go in the woods, I run into Bigfoot. Seems to me that Bigfoot exists because I spend like a week hanging out with Bigfoot, like, playing Nintendo or whatever. And I come back out of the woods. Now, it does actually seem to me that Bigfoot is real. Do you have the burden of proof to show that Bigfoot isn't real?
I would
imagine that scenario.
Yeah.
It seems to me that Bigfoot is real. So you have the burden of proof to show that, you shoulder the burden of proof to show that I didn't encounter Bigfoot. That's a weird claim because I'm the one going around making a claim, and then you're just going, why should I believe that? So when realists say it seems to me that realism is true, okay, fine. Should I believe realism is true? What if I just say, fine, I grant that it seems true to you and you're justified? What should I believe? What would Michael Jones say? I don't know. But like, am I obliged to accept that realism is true myself unless I could show that how things seem to Michael Jones is false? So why wouldn't that apply in the opposite direction?
Yeah,
why would Michael Jones have to show that I'm wrong?
Like you said, I think you said this earlier, this burden of proof stuff is like very, I think, institutional in the sense that, like, if you're in a context of debate or if you want to expose someone, hey, I know this. Well, how do you know it? I want to know if you can support that. I mean, that's the extent that I use this notion of burden of proof. And I feel like in a dialectic, or if you're really trying to come to the bottom of an issue, right? Like, this burden of proof stuff has very little relevance to those sort of academic enterprises. Like, burden of proof to me is more when you're playing a game or a debate, or you want to expose someone's that they say I know when you don't think they know. I don't really think it has very much place if you're trying to figure out. I mean, imagine like you're on a team, like, or you're collaborating with others on a project, and then you just pull out this, someone thinks, I think this is the right answer. And you say, well, I don't think that's the right answer. Give me the burden of proof. Like, they just start pulling this burden of proof stuff. Like, it seems to be missing the kind of enterprise, or the academic enterprise, or the goal of like trying to come to the bottom of the issue. I don't really think this burden of the proof stuff has a lot of place in what I think, like, in the pursuit of what is the fact of the matter here. But anyways, that's my view.
Yeah, I don't think that this is pushing us towards philosophical progress very much to try to make these moves. I think that they're sort of foundationally misguided in that I reject the very idea that there's some fact of the matter about who has the burden of proof. The idea here seems to be that if a certain like, here's this really simplified model, and maybe this isn't what Michael Jones thinks, but the model might be something like this. There are facts about what is or is not intuitive. It's not like this is an individual matter, like what is or isn't tasty. It's more like there are facts. Some claims are intuitive, some are not. Realism is one of the facts that's intuitive. And so realism has that like a default priority and like presumption in favor of it. And any views which are intuitive, we start with those intuitive views. And then we look at what the world is like. We look at the deductive arguments, the a priori arguments, empirical data, all that stuff. And then we update from there. And so if you want to move away from realism, which is the default position, that's a revisionary position. You can revise your views and reject realism, but you're going to have to do the work to do that. That seems to be kind of similar to what's going on here. And what I think doesn't occur to realists, and maybe this is because anti-realists rarely make this point, is we're not required to accept your default set of starting assumptions. One, I don't think that there's a single default that we're all starting from. Different people can have different default starting systems. And I think someone like Mike Huemer would absolutely grant this with phenomenal conservatism, that my phenomenology what seems to me to be true doesn't have to be what seems to be true to you. And so two people can both be justified in holding radically divergent perspectives. And when that occurs, it's no longer clear that one can appeal to how things seem or what's intuitive to make a burden of proof claim, because that burden of proof claim might only make sense if there's the two people are actually agreeing on how things seem. So if we both agree it seems that X, and then I want to say, but not X, now I'm more okay with someone saying, okay, well, we both agree it seems like X. Like, imagine we're both looking out the window and it looks like there's an elephant. And we're both like, yeah, it really seems like there's an elephant. And then I go, you know what? But I don't think there's an elephant. At that point, maybe it would make sense for you to turn to me and say, what? But it's right there. It's like moving around and stuff. It doesn't even look, it looks fully 3D. What are you talking about? You think there's no elephant out there? Prove it. And then, I go out there and I wave my hand around and I bump into the elephant and it turns around and interacts with me. Okay, there's an elephant there. Or I go out there and I put my hand through it. I'm like, no, it's a hologram. Then you might go, okay, there's not an elephant, right? But if you look out the window and say, and I'm like, Danny, there's no elephant out there. And you're like, no, but I see it. The burden of proof is on you to show there's no elephant. Wouldn't that be really bizarre? Like, the burden of proof is you show there's no elephant. In fact, why don't you go ahead and shoulder, because it seems to me there's an elephant right behind me right now. Prove it. Prove there's no elephant. It's strange. Like, what entitles, like, in other words, what privileges how things seem to realists over how they seem to anti-realists? I think the answer is nothing, and that they don't really have a case here.
Yeah.
And lack any reason to hold to their position. Nor can they just assume their wider metaphysical belief is true and incompatible with moral realism, so therefore moral realism cannot be true. This is sadly how many layman moral skeptics argue. They just assume moral realism is incompatible with their materialistic or similar beliefs, therefore there cannot be objective moral facts. That in itself is just a form of assuming you're...
Are you a materialist?
No.
Neither am I. So just a note here. It's like lots of materialists. Yeah, we're not even materialists. So just to flag that a lot of times, and this is something that I think is common for Christian apologists, is to presume that their opposition are a bunch of like naive materialists. And a lot of those objections might actually be good. I'm not a materialist. But like, so what? So they're arguing against some material. Okay, then those people are wrong. Now, am I wrong?
Conclusion, and not making a case for an alternative to moral realism. Until the skeptics do, moral realism is intuitively true and the best explanation of the moral landscape.
Well, guys, remember this was the second part of the video. You should check out our first part if you didn't watch it. I'll have to teach Lance how to make that pop up as you're watching the video on the top right. Did you know?
Yeah, I need to finally do that kind of thing.
Yeah, but yeah. Do you have any closing thoughts?
I have. Well, I may not even be closing yet. The first thing though to say is, well, first of all, thank you for this like epic journey through a 14-minute video that took us 3 hours to get through. I just feel like I need to be more concise. I'm so sorry.
No. Like you said, the video made. I mean, it was claim after claim after claim after. So there's a lot to go through here, even though it was only 14 minutes. But that makes sense. That why it went that long, it makes sense.
Yeah, I also want to thank you for joining me though, because it's so much more digestible to get through this material to have another person with me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks for having me.
I hope you got value out of it.
Oh, I did. I'm gonna have to maybe, what do you call it? Repost our discussion here. And I think our other video I might repost on my YouTube channel. So yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Lance.
Yeah. I think you can like simultaneously stream to both channels, so we could do that the next time
Okay,
if you
that
want.
sounds good.
The other thing to note is I'm at 799 subscribers. So if you're watching this right now and you subscribe, you will be person number 800. So please subscribe so you get to be 800. So there's also that. Now, finally, there were questions. I want to go through them. Do you want to stick around for that? Because I'm going to stick around to handle questions.
You would handle the questions because I have another commitment. So
okay. Is that okay with you though? Because then you're part of the video and then you're going.
No, that makes total sense. So you can handle the questions from your viewers, and then thanks for having me, Lance.
Great. Okay, so this is Danny from Field Talk. Any final parting words for yourself to promote yourself and what you do?
Yeah. So like I said in the first part, I have a YouTube channel, discuss mostly philosophy, religion stuff, but this stuff and really intersects. I also had a recent discussion on inspiring philosophy on the Trinity. You could check that out. Trust me, it's a little bit entertaining in terms of what transpires in that video. But yeah, otherwise I'm good to go. Thanks, Lance.
Awesome. Okay. So we should do. I just have a proposal. Which you know what? I'll just tell you about the proposal later. I don't have to do it here.
Okay. All right.
All right. Thanks so much for being here. I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Bye.
Okay. See you later. Okay. So now I could get to questions from the past 2 hours. So let's get through all of that. So let's get through that. And again, thanks, Danny, for joining me. And both this video and the previous one, because we did a previous video with Danny. I'll link to Danny's channel. Go check out Danny's channel, subscribe, support Danny. This is, I mean, part of the reason for these collaborations is so people can find out about other people's work and see what else is out there. So do check that out. Okay. All right. See some stuff from a while ago about qualia. All right. So Edgar says, Lance independent. Does moral anti-realism imply relativism in relation to logic? Are the norms of classical logic categorical or hypothetical? So moral anti-realism has nothing to do with logic. So no, it does not imply anything about logic. All right. So we have Sapir comments on, I love the stance independently spooky background. Yeah, that's just something from Canva. So nothing fancy there. All right. Okay, there's a long set of comments. I'm not going to post all those because it take a long time to get through those. So I'm going to look for more condensed and compressed questions. And especially do ping me if you want to ask me a question because it's easier for me to find them that way. All right. Still going through, so it's just going to take me a bit. It's a little awkward to be reading while I'm on here. There was lots of comments. All right, Daniel Kelly says the phrase, I'm doing this for self-promotion reasons. The phrase of normative entanglement is brilliant. I'm definitely using that in the future. Thank you. Please do bring it up. I do have a couple blog posts where I outline it. And, eventually I'm going to have a paper where once I run a couple more studies and, see if the finding replicates. If it doesn't, I'm going to try to publish that anyway. And, maybe it's not a very robust effect, but I think it will be. I don't think this is a very surprising thing that you find that if, you ask someone if it's objectively wrong to torture babies and they say no, that people think the person's kind of a jerk. So when I get more studies on that, then there'll be empirical evidence showing that this sort of thing is true. And then what I want to do is generalize this kind of effect. I do have another article or two on that as well, where I talk about this generalizing outside of the moral context. And I think it's a sort of ubiquitous feature of the way analytic philosophers argue. So I think that there are deep metaphilosophical problems with I want to say, I say metaphilosophical, but I kind of mean like the sociology of analytic philosophy. And there are problems with the way that philosophers go about doing what they're doing. And I think they're not realizing it. And I think it's a very serious problem. But yeah, please use it. You're welcome to just start throwing the term out there. And, I hope that it gets popular enough that there's like a Wikipedia entry for it. And there's like, it's a known thing. So, giving it a term, like putting a name on this sort of problem, I think can be really, really helpful. All right. A lot of people talking about inspiring philosophy. I'm not going to be posting that stuff up here. All right. All right. There's so many comments. Thanks so much, everybody, for the engagement. And if you were looking to interact with me more, that's just not what I was doing in this video. If you come to my Saturday streams, those are more about interacting with my audience. And I've been doing my best to get really interactive with people. Sometimes, as you see, I tend to go on tirades. I've been doing my best, and I've been successful with, instead of getting back to people a half hour, it only takes me a few minutes. And I just really look for people popping up in the stream for me to interact with them. So, and I do bring guests on, like impromptu from the audience, if people want to talk to me on occasion. I've done that a few times. Sometimes it's worked out well. Sometimes it could be a little challenging. One time I brought like 5 people on, and I thought that was too many people at once, especially because I wasn't experienced handling that many people. And I'm not very aggressive with regulating how people interact. So if people end up talking to each other the whole time, then I end up just sitting there, and that could be awkward. But but now I'm transitioning more into a more chill part of the stream right now. So we'll see where this goes. And if there's not a whole lot at the end of it, then I guess we'll close it out. Okay, lots of kind of fun or silly comments. Some people debating each other. All right. Okay. Okay, I'm not seeing a whole lot of specific comments that it makes sense for me to respond to. If you did ask one and I didn't see it, please let me know. There was one that I missed. Let me see if I could find that. Where was that? One moment, I'll pull that one up, even though my answer to that is going to be underwhelming. Oh, I'm not seeing it in here anymore. Yeah, it's gone. Okay. There was a question about what I think of Hume's metaphilosophy. Conservatism. I have quite a few blog posts about that, and I don't have that much directly to say to dispute phenomenal conservatism, so that might be kind of disappointing. And then I haven't really read Hume's like metaphilosophical work, so I couldn't tell you. So don't have much to say about that. Let's see if there's any more questions. Okay, so we have this. I gave an example of logic because it is normative. All arguments, justifications, and positions imply acceptance of logic. Thus, we have true normative statements, logical laws. So simply because all arguments, justifications, and positions imply the acceptance of logic, even if that were true, I don't think that would entail like stance-independent normativity. I don't think that follows. So like, I don't think that you're going to get any kind of stance-independent normativity out of, like, you can't say this without presupposing that is true or something like that. That's not showing that I ought to accept it or that I have a reason to accept it independent of whether I want to. It might just mean that I must accept this in order to do that. I don't see why that couldn't be cashed out in fully descriptive terms without the irreducible normativity. So, all right. So let's see, we have, do you take our base preferences to be something like brute facts? They are just without justification. So I wouldn't call them brute facts. So, a brute fact, so it depends what you mean by justification. So like, it's a fact that I like cilantro. I think it would be weird to ask for a justification for why I like cilantro. There's going to be a causal explanation. And so in that sense, it's not going to be a brute fact that I like cilantro. It's really going to, I mean, what exactly do you mean by a brute fact? So there's going to be reasons why. It's just that the reasons aren't, they're not normative. It's not like a normative account that explains why it's like good for me to like cilantro, or why I ought to like cilantro, or why liking cilantro is like the correct attitude to take towards cilantro. Like that's just all just weird. It's like a category error. It's like asking what's the moral justification for like the fact that like what hydrogen atoms have one proton in their nucleus. Like this doesn't make sense. And so since I think that preferences are just psychological facts about people, they are descriptive facts in the way that, like, you know, I'm wearing glasses is a descriptive fact about me. So it just doesn't make sense to ask for that kind of justification. But again, you could give an explanation for why the person has the preference. Yeah, so the Mahayanist mind says I asked one about humor. That was the one I was responding to. I couldn't find it in the StreamYard stuff. I searched for it with the timestamp and everything, and it disappeared. But yeah, the question was something about what I think of humor's metaphilosophy. I don't know enough about humor's metaphilosophy to comment on it. There was another one that I missed it. Okay, so that looks like it for the questions. Okay, so here's another one. Great. If you have more questions, keep them coming. I could do this for at least a few more minutes. So Edgar asks, have you thought about inviting Michael Huemer onto the channel? He often visits even little known channels. I have. So Michael Huemer is like a big name in academic like meta ethics. And, you know, I haven't even had the channel a full year. You know, I feel like if I want to talk to Huemer, I should be a bit more prepared. And that would mean, among other things, reading Huemer's books. So, you know, reading Huemer's book on ethical intuitionism, reading Huemer's more recent book, what's that called? Facts, Reality, and Values, something like that. Let's look it up. So I'd like to at least read a couple of Huemer's books. I've read some of Huemer's papers. I tend to read articles more than I read books. Knowledge, Reality, and Value, a mostly common sense guide to philosophy. So I think I should probably read that and ethical intuitionism at the very least before I have a conversation with Huemer. So it's just a question of being more prepared and to, you know, if I'm going to talk to someone that's really put the work in to write up their views on the issue, it seems, I wouldn't say disrespectful, but at least unwise of me to not actually just go through that work. Because when people write their ideas down, they can put a lot of work into writing them as clearly and carefully as possible. I've criticized Huemer's remarks in videos and then subsequently discovered that Huemer is more clear and like more, I think, more accurate in written work. And, you know, like what I say loosely in these conversations, I'm going to goof things up. I'm going to say things that are wrong. And taking my remarks on a live stream as some sort of canonical expression of my views would be a little silly. If I have written work that is like, here's my views on X, and then someone asked me in an interview, I could just goof things up. So yes, I'd like to talk to Huemer at some point. I should read Huemer's work before I do that. Oh, okay. So I think that is going to wrap it up for me for now in terms of answering questions. We'll close it out there. Let's see if I got to 800. Let's see. I'm refreshing my page to see if I made it. It's still $7.99. Not one of you subscribed. Okay, so I mentioned this before, and I don't know if other people have dropped in. I'm at 799 subscribers. So you got to subscribe so I can hit 800, please. So this is not that important. I don't care. It's been steadily raising since the past couple days. So it'll hit 800 sooner or later anyway. But it'd be nice to hit that 800. I do want to hit 1,000 by the end of the year. That'd be cool. So I got a few more months to go, and I think I'll be able to pull it off. So I started the channel, I think, and when was my first video? I think it was early January, and so like it's, you know, still less than a year. I'm gonna go through and look. Let's see where we're at in terms of progress. It was January 7th of this year. So yeah, it really was the start of the year. So we're a little past 10 months in, and I think at the time I had something like 70 subscribers. And so now I'm at over 700. So it's been 10 times the original amount. I don't know if that's good growth or not. I kind of do pretty narrow range of topics. and it's not super popular topics. I'm not like streaming games or talking about news stuff. So, oh, I got someone saying I should have 800 now. Maybe I should do something for when I hit 1,000 people, like some sort of special celebratory event. What should I do? I don't know what I should do. If you got suggestions, let me know. Try not to make them too ridiculous. All right, let's check it out. Did I hit 800? I am at 800. All right, thanks so much. So, woo! That's awesome. I hit 800. So that's pretty cool. I'm excited about that. And yeah, so we'll see if I get 1,000 by the end of the year. Yeah. Okay. So this one is people do AMAs when they hit milestones. So here's my concern about AMAs. I am super duper duper narrow about the topics I'm comfortable discussing or that I want to discuss. And so, I see Kane B does AMAs, and Kane will answer any question. It could be quite like really personal questions about. So, one thing is Kane B just has much more broader and extensive knowledge of philosophy in general than me. So Kane B can answer questions on a wide variety of philosophical views on many different issues. I just can't do that. I have a pretty narrow set of interests and views. And so I just, like, a lot of questions would be, I don't know, or I don't want to talk about it. So an AMA, I think I would love to do one, but I think I would have to deflect or not answer so many questions. It would be frustrating for people and not a lot of fun. So I think the answer to that is no to an AMA. I just don't think it would be very enjoyable for people. So I'm not sure what to do other than that. I should say I have I'm in the works on a couple guests. I still didn't post one of the talks I did back a couple months ago. I have to do some editing, and I've only ever really edited the intros to videos, and that's going to take a little more work to edit that. There's no excuse. I just got to sit down, focus, and get it done. Okay, so I don't know what else to bring up. I hit my 800 mark. We did this video. I'm going to have more guests on the channel coming up. Is there anything else to go over? Things have slowed down a bit on the blog. I'm working on some larger blog pieces. One of them is to talk about the anti-realist trilemma, which is, something that I have started to say, is to go around saying that all arguments for all moral realist positions are false, trivial, or unintelligible. The biggest part of that is explaining the unintelligibility thesis. And that is basically my view that certain terms and concepts that are employed by non-naturalist moral realists, I think, are meaningless. They just don't mean anything. And so they're not even wrong. If someone tries to say, we have external reasons to do X, I don't even think that's a proposition. I think it's nonsense. So that strikes a lot of people as a really radical claim. I don't actually think it's very radical because, among other things, if a view is false, it's not in any better a position in practical respects than if it's meaningless in most respects. The other is that, sometimes people will think, for instance, it's rather insulting or condescending or rude to suggest that a person's views are nonsensical. I find that really puzzling because from my perspective, I think that the views are meaningless because there are underlying foundational, like methodological issues or presuppositions about how language and meaning work, or people are inducted into thinking in certain ways that are like rather excusable shortcomings if I'm correct that they're shortcomings. And so people end up being mistaken for reasons that are very downstream of the mistake being made. So like they're saying a thing, it's not meaningful. The reason it's not meaningful is because of this kind of elaborate causal explanation for how they ended up holding this sort of mistakes about how language and meaning work. Whereas, think about if you just say that, for instance, the moral realist is incorrect. Well, they're incorrect and there's no conceptual confusions or problems about language or foundational issues. That's kind of suggesting, okay, so they're actually in a good position to know that the position is incorrect. The arguments on the table are actually pretty compelling in favor of anti-realism. They're aware of the arguments. They read about them all the time. There aren't foundational methodological problems, but they're wrong anyway. Like, what are you implying there? That the person's incompetent? So, if I think people are making an understandable mistake, and that's why the position ends up being the result of a kind of conceptual mistake, and the position isn't propositional, but someone else thinks, no, it's propositional, they're just wrong. Why isn't that a more condescending or insulting or rude kind of thing to say? This is something I've written about before, but it's kind of weird. People seem to almost take offense at the suggestion that realist concepts are unintelligible, but saying they're completely intelligible and realists are just radically mistaken why is that not objectionable? So I think it's a bit strange to say that there's something sort of like rude about the position. I'm not trying to be rude. This is just maybe it could be rude even if I'm not trying to be, but I don't think that it is. It's kind of strange how people react, because I don't understand why people don't just tell me I'm wrong. They often posture as if I'm doing something that's like more inappropriate than being mistaken, and it's often puzzling why people are doing that. Anyway, so there's a big blog post on that. I'm not even going to get into it. It's too long for it to be a blog post, so I'm going to have to split it up and do subsections. But I really want to get that out there so that I'll have a reference when people ask me about unintelligibility, like what is the position? What do you mean by that? Why do you hold that position? And then I could just say, boom, here's a like 2 or 3 links that'll cover the groundwork of what I'm saying with the anti-realist trilemma and the unintelligibility thesis. So I have that one, and then I have one that's like I'm not going to get into all of them. I think that's the most important one to focus on for now. So I think that's about it. Yeah, if you have other questions, post them in the comments and I'll try to engage there, because I'm going to wrap up for now. I hit the 2-hour mark. Okay, so I'm going to close things out there. Thank you for subscribing. And if go check out Danny's channel at Phil Talk. And thanks everybody for being here. And I guess I'll close it out there. Thanks so much for being here. Take care, everybody.